Welcome to No Sex, Please. I'm religious. For 2,000 years and more, religion has had its own way with sex. The greatest battle it has ever faced is how to control the masses who love it. And so began the story of shame and disgust and dishonour. Forget he who must be named, but never forget it that must always be kept undercover. G'day everyone, I'm David Aleph. Purity culture was just another religious aberration in regards to sex introduced to protect, now read control, Christian teenagers. Not only was sex before marriage a sin, it was a quick and easy pathway to unforgivable slutdom for women. In a good old misogynist salute to patriarchy, it was a bit more forgivable, but a forever shaming sin for boys. So best practice, don't ask, don't tell. Claire Heath McIver had her own battle with purity culture, hence the title Purity Uncultured. But she is an amazing woman. Her story told on 60 Minutes late last year. With her husband, she left her father's church, which they claimed was not a good place for her or the gay husband her father encouraged her to marry. Please subscribe. And if you can give just $1, please help us through patreon.com/no sex please to support LGBTIQ refugees who have suffered a living hell in Africa, where it's about to get worse. Also consider, well, no, don't consider, you need to do it. Go to my medium.com/no sex please page and read the article that I've written about this, including the story about Claire. Thanks, folks. And now to the interview. I have Claire McIver with me today, and your podcast name, Claire, is?
It's Unchurchable with Kit Kennedy, because yes, when I started writing and podcasting in this space, I was still trying to hide behind a veil of anonymity, which got blown to pieces last year. But yeah, Kit Kennedy is my deconstruction name. Claire Heath McIver is my real name.
Wonderful. Look, we've known each other for a few years now, and when I met you and your former husband and good friend Patrick,
yes,
and father of your two beautiful children.
My two beautiful spirited hurricanes, yes, I believe we were sitting at the McDonald's Playland in Morwell.
We were.
On that first meeting, and it was really fascinating hearing your story at that stage of our deconstruction and kind of processing all that had happened to us at that point, and not foreseeing the absolute roller coaster ride that the next few years would be. But yes, I do remember that day very well.
I'm really glad we've kept in touch over that period, and I've been able to see something of your journey. And by the way, I absolutely adore what you write about your kids. There's got to be a book in that. It really has.
Parenthood, because my son is 6.5 and my daughter has just turned 5. And as parents will attest, when your kids are that age, the sheer frustration, like the internal screaming and swearing that goes on beneath the surface of any given parent it's constant. And my kids are very spirited, and I love that about them. I think if they were boring kids, I would have felt like I'd done something wrong. But they're smart. I asked God for smart kids, and when she delivered, I was like, dang, I should have asked for a potato, because it's hard to raise smart kids. So the things they say sometimes, I'm like, either I'm going to see the humor in this, or I'm just going to start headbutting a wall or something. I love them. But yeah, it's funny. Parenthood is funny.
Oh, look, it is. We've actually got some funny stories because our kids were homeschooled because of the cult situation we were in.
It's homeschooled because of a situation.
And I was also the pastor of the group after God died.
That's bonkers to me. That's a weird position to be in.
Yeah. As I've often said, I could have been God, but just didn't quite have the skills.
Maybe this
that close.
The skills or the delusion?
Oh, yeah, the delusions of grandeur and the narcissism's the number one thing you need.
Yes.
I seem to have missed that somehow.
Oh, bless you. It's interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of reflection that goes on because I'm the eldest daughter of pastors who run their totally cool and normal church. And obviously, like, I can say this now, like on 60 Minutes, like a few of us were asked whether we thought it was a cult, and the answer was yes. that I did think it was that. And that is a statement of my opinion, because who gets to classify a cult? I'm saying all of this so I don't get my ass sued. But, that's a weird thing to grapple with after losing community and losing connection with family, and having, because originally it was an estrangement that kind of was instigated by my dad, but now it's an estrangement that I choose to keep for my psychological safety, for my children's psychological safety, for this ongoing, these reasons. Yeah, but you go, okay, is there narcissism involved here? And I have my opinions on that, but as the eldest daughter, I'm so aware that of all my siblings, I'm probably the most like my dad, in that I'm very charismatic. I can easily draw people's attention. I can easily draw their sympathy, and leadership comes natural to me. So I have to make sure that I don't slip into narcissism and become the worst parts of, I feel like there's this sliding doors ahead of me. So I get therapy, and I keep I really do fear, I think, becoming a narcissist and having some of these personality markers that are just so toxic, and that lend themselves so much to believing your own bullshit and becoming a god unto yourself, and that we see in cult leaders around the world. I look at this sliding doors picture of myself and go, I'm responsible now to really make sure that I continue to contribute to the world in a good way, in a healthy way, and I don't become a toxic narcissist who builds a system around her that exists solely for my own gratification. It's a weird thing, but it is
weird, but all credit to you for recognizing that, because there are many children of parents who have done terrible things in all kinds of different ways, and who have similar fears.
Yeah.
And those fears keep you safe, I think.
Yeah.
If you didn't have that and you just wanted the power that dad or mum or whoever had.
God.
Claire, do you mind if I now share the promo for those who may not have seen it, just to set the scene? Because I want to give some background to what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But also then I want to focus on the sex stuff.
Okay.
Because as we've previously talked, the sex shame that is so massive from churches, particularly like your parents' church and others, but also it goes back centuries, goes back to St. Augustine of all people.
Saint. Quotes. Yes, go for it. Share the promo.
Yes. So I'm sure that you don't get great joy in actually seeing that every time.
Yeah, look, the first time I saw it, it was a shock. I was in bed. It was a Thursday morning. I'm not a morning person. And I shook, I actually shook seeing that, because it's almost as a self-protection mechanism. You can build this sort of wall in your head, like that didn't really happen, and it's a denial thing, which is a stage of grief, and we all need psychological safety. But since moving to Melbourne, I'd kept the whole cult girl thing on the down low, trying to blend in with the normals. And every now and then, because Patrick and I hang out with some of the same people still, some like very different people, but some of the same people, every now and then you'd be laughing around drinks or anything, and we go, oh, I remember when, and you drop this story that was totally normal for you, and then it just sucks the air out of the room, and people just look at you like you're from Mars, and you go, oh, you just brush it off. You brush it to the back of your mind. Doing the interview with Nick, because even talking to him on background and all that kind of stuff, it was just me sitting with a guy who was really friendly in a cafe and talking about my life. It was fun almost. But then when you do this interview and he sucks the air out of the room, and he's not going to let you talk about other people's stories, which I did, and he's not going to let you lean really into rationalizing why people behave like this. He's just there to talk about you. Like, I left and just was in a fog for 3 days. When the promo came out, Patrick and I then had to go and do a photo shoot with the Age photographer park that's down near us. And then we sat in a cafe nearby and cried. And it was a real moment of, this is real, and it is so not normal, and it is so beyond the scope of the normal Christian life, which these days is so, well, within evangelicalism at least, and certainly there are churches that aren't toxic. Actually, I'm not going to say certainly. Most likely there are churches that aren't toxic, that aren't damaging to people. I'm a bit cynical about that, but there's a lot of churches at the moment that are far beyond the scope of what's normal for a normal life. And we really, that there was a lot of grief Nowadays, I've seen it so many times. It's been reposted on my Facebook wall so many times. I've watched the full 60 minutes thing enough times to not have that visceral reaction to it now. It's just a thing that happened. But there's also this abiding recognition that there's so many people whose stories weren't told on that. There was another 4 or 5 that went into the age spread, but this isn't even 1% of our stories. So there's this feeling of, it's not enough. But whatever is enough, there's been a degree of unburdening, and now I move on. Yeah.
And look, I think it's very important that everybody who goes through an experience like that, and it is, I believe it's pure abuse, because it's playing with your mind.
Oh, yeah.
It's playing with your free will, all those sorts of things.
Finances, sexuality,
everything.
Yeah.
And that society should recognise that. And of course, there's tax benefits for churches and tax benefits for others and so on, which are huge.
Yeah.
It makes for a very unjust society.
Yeah, and all of that, because there's also impacts on gender roles, and there's also impacts on how you view your ability to, because as a woman in a complementarian system, complementarian meaning let's see men and women as equal in value but different in function, which is really just really nice speak for men are the leaders, women are the followers, don't teach, don't preach, or only do so under the authority of the pastor. There's this kind of, and I'm not speaking directly about my dad's church here, I'm speaking about evangelicalism more broadly, but you learn to fear emotions, you learn to dull negative emotions, which for a lot of people, I think manifests as depression and anxiety, because we're supposed to express the full range of human emotion. It is part of the way that we interact with the world. And now I'm trying to teach my kids how to have healthy bodily autonomy, how to express anger when they're angry, how to express sadness when they're sad, because I don't want to squash that in childhood and then have a sort of ulcerated experience as they grow, because I had to learn how to handle anger in my 30s. I had to learn how to handle sadness in my 30s, and it's cost me a pretty penny because psychologists are $200 an hour or whatever. There's a lot to it. And I think especially sitting at this moment in history where we've had Ravi Zacharias, one of the great apologists of our time, die with all of these sexual abuse and sexual harassment things swirling around him. And I absolutely believe the victims. We've got Hillsong, the fall of Hillsong, with a lot of their pastors going through marriage breakups. And then, of course, there's Brian Houston currently facing court over covering up his dad's sexual abuse of children. But also we've had this whole thing where he just accidentally went into a woman's room for 40 minutes and didn't know how to get out, and it was the pills or whatever. We've got Bobby Houston on Facebook being really couched in denial over, this is persecution. This can't have been that her husband has done something wrong. I feel a point of reckoning for the church where these power structures that lend themselves so easy to abuse and to covering it up and to putting doctrine over person, all of that kind of stuff, victim shaming, victim blaming, weaponization of the word forgiveness. It's time for this to be countered. And yes, tax churches. I think churches should definitely be taxed.
One thing about taxing churches is that it makes them accountable.
Yes.
They can't hide what they're doing. And of course, there are other extreme cults that do all kinds of things with tax money, tax-free money.
And government grant money and volunteer labour and all sorts of things. There's a lot there.
And they run schools where, like their program recently that talked about the girls being told that if they sleep around, they'll be sluts. And
so that was Opus Dei.
Opus Dei, yes.
Four Corners, Louise Milligan. Watch it if you haven't, with a trigger warning in mind, I think, because it's pretty hardcore. But I was really thrilled to see Louise Milligan take that on and Four Corners take that on. And I did write on both of my websites, Kit Kennedy and Unchurchable podcast. I published the same article both places, my recount of how purity culture affected me. But like this self-mortification practice that they had of these barbed wire garters to wear if you were experiencing the wrong sorts of thoughts and stuff like that. And been studying psychology for the last while. I've just dropped out because there's too darn much going on in my life. But one thing that really struck me was the whole concept of conditioning. We hear it in Pavlov's dog. We're supposed to have certain reactions to certain stimuli. We're supposed to salivate when we smell food or whatever. And Pavlov, this early psychological researcher, got to this. He actually conditioned dogs to associate the sound of a bell with the smell of food, and the dogs would salivate at the sound of the bell.
Yes.
And I sit with that now and I go, we were taught to fear so many aspects of ourselves in church, and it creates a fear response in the nervous system.
Yes.
It creates that deeply ingrained fear, which, I mean, in the case of purity culture and in the case of the topic of this podcast, sex, it's so damaging, because if your fear response is activated, you're running for your life. You don't want to be baby making. So the responses are all off. And when you associate that with shame and with self-mortification and all of that, no wonder we've got so many purity culture marriages on the rocks or falling to bits now, because we were promised happily ever after. We were promised great sex. We were promised all of this if we would just absolutely switch off and hate and despise desire outside of marriage. And it doesn't revert on the wedding night. It's not what happens. Or in my case, you discover in the years after, oh, he actually is gay. The gay conversion therapy doesn't work. But
I noticed on that 60-minute piece where they interview the other guy who's
James,
there. And he's talking about the exorcism and so on. The cult that we were part of started off as an exorcism ministry focusing purely on deliverance and healing. And it was part of the Anglican Church. And so demons were everywhere. And I can tell you as an insider that I think there was probably certainly no male who had exorcism, because everybody did. And most women who had exorcism had to have same-sex demons cast out. Now, maybe we were miles ahead, because the studies these days talk about people being on a spectrum, and the purely heterosexual people there and the purely same-sex attracted people there and everybody else in between.
The Kinsey scale, yes.
Yes, and so much shame that no one is going to talk about it. So when you talk about, what is it? What do they say, 1% or 2% or 5%? When people aren't going to talk about it, where does the scale fit?
Exactly.
But maybe we were ahead of our time. But
look, it was very interesting. I didn't actually know James's story. I knew he had a hell of a story, but we lost contact. We hadn't seen each other in 20 years. And I'm just so impressed at how James has weathered an incredible amount of trauma. But actually hearing from him after filming, because we didn't compare notes before filming. Even Patrick and I didn't compare notes before filming. We didn't even speak to each other afterwards for 24 hours. Or actually, no, I think I went to a friend's house and then debrief and then went over to his. But I didn't ever actually chat to James until after. And then I was like, whoa, that's just so heavy. And here's my thing. I hate the word deliverance.
Me too.
I really do, because, so right before we were managed out the door of my dad's church, I'll put it that way, and subsequently shunned, or subsequently had all of our relationships just magically disappear overnight.
That's a miracle, actually, isn't it?
Oh gosh,
you've got to call that a miracle.
I've got to call it something. Painful, traumatic, just horrendous.
Awful,
just
absolutely awful.
The fabric and nature of everyone overnight basically thinking you're a different person and discontinuing their genuine interest in you and making contact very difficult, if not impossible. That had come on the back of 4 miscarriages. So 4 miscarriages in a year, and then the day we found out we were pregnant with Henry, which was Remembrance Day, which is a bit of a superstitious point, 11/11. That was the day that the big fight happened between Dad and Patrick, and it all started to unravel from there. But Dad had been suggesting, like, I'd gone to get counselling because I had PTSD and my trauma hadn't been adequately handled by the church, and these beautiful people were counselling me through that. And I really wanted to dump my faith then, but Patrick was like, no, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. My children will go to this church. And it's something he looks back on now with a lot of shame. But
it's hard to shake it. It's hard to shake it.
Yeah. And you know what? You got to forgive yourself, because you didn't know.
You do.
You didn't know.
You do.
But Dad wanted me to go, he wanted me to change the counselling. Like, he wanted me to dump this counselling, which was going really well for me, and was Christian people. He wanted me to dump that and study Romans 5, which is, I think, all about sin. And I was like, I'm not miscarrying because of sin.
Oh, God.
And I just said, no, this is working for me. And then that that created a moment of tension when Patrick said, no, we're sticking with this, because I needed the man of the house to cover me there and say, no, my wife is sticking with this. And then Dad wanted me to go to New Zealand to go through a fire tunnel. Have you heard of fire tunnels?
Oh, please, no. Oh, go on. Tell me.
So fire tunnels is when these hardcore deliverance ministries, they get, from what I can tell, because I never did it, they get like a guard of honor, like people put their hands, like they lean above you.
Yeah.
There's all these people with their hands above you and they're praying in tongues aggressively, casting out the demons. And you go through this tunnel over and over again until the demon is out of you. Now, imagine putting someone with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Absolutely terrible. Terrible.
For whom yelling, shouting sounds like screaming.
Yeah.
For whom that's a trigger. Imagine putting them through that. And then the confirmation bias that sets in because, oh, she's reacting, she's teary, she's screaming, she's hearing voices.
Obviously demons.
It's obviously demons. No,
Yeah.
It's not. It's post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's an acute stress reaction. It's a panic attack. It's a reaction to a traumatic thing that is happening now in the present as they're going through the fire tunnel, and also bringing up stuff from the past. Of course, they're going to get reactions from people and then call them demons coming out. But it's rubbish. It's absolutely rubbish.
It's rubbish.
We now know through actually studying how the human mind works, what's going on here. But I will admit, I do laugh at sometimes these memes that go around on the internet. I saw one meme recently of somebody having the spirit of oral sex thrown out of them. And
I saw that.
That was like, I felt for it. I really did. But I was also like, oh my God. Yeah, that was hilarious and heartbreaking at the same time. But you do have to give yourself permission to laugh, I think, a little bit.
Oh, you do. You've got to. Laughter is healing.
Yeah. The humor is 100% part of the healing. Oh.
Can you imagine people from another, let's say there was another aliens who were intelligent beings who could look at us and see, and maybe they've got their, if they existed, they'd have their own gods or something, but see people, when science is so wonderful and where we can understand so many things today about the human brain, the mind, about PTSD. People came back from the First World War and they were totally different people from the person who went. And yes, they reacted terribly if there was a loud noise or loud people speaking. They weren't to talk about it. They didn't. No. And that person was never the same. Now we understand PTSD.
Oh, yeah. And that person was never the same, but their marriage was never the same. Their children were never the same.
Absolutely.
And the silent generation led into the baby boomers, and the baby boomers led into generations X, Y, Z, the millennials. And now we're starting to understand, even on an epigenetic level, which is basically the set of switches built into your DNA that decides how gene expression happens.
Yeah.
Epigenetically, PTSD can be passed on, or the propensity to have that. And sometimes I'm dealing with my daughter and the way that she's learning to navigate emotions, and she's a beautiful artistic soul and she's so smart and I just love her. But I realize from the get-go, I'm having to parent in a way that makes her emotionally literate, because in my DNA, in the epigenetic code I've passed on to her, there's an increased risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. Thank you, church. Thank you for what you've done to my family line. Now I have to heal it. And that's a big responsibility. And that's why the change makers, the black sheep who stepped out, the healers of their generational line, you may never live up to your own expectations of what you could have been if you didn't go through all that trauma, but you're doing some badass work that affects a lot of people, and you've got to really be proud of yourself for that.
No, look, I think you do. And if you then compare to the people who are still stuck in groups similar to your father's church and others, and the harm is continuing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's tragic. Look, I want to ask you specifically about the purity stuff. And I noticed in one of your posts, I think overnight, and as I said earlier, I love what you write about your kids. There's a beautiful book in that. And on the other hand, there is the thing of the kids when they get older, they're going to look back. And my younger daughter sent me a message just before, on Christmas Eve, we were catching up with their family and with her partner's family. And the message was, Dad, I am not your little girl anymore. I'm 40 years old. Behave yourself. Don't say.
Yes.
And
yes.
I got there and found that his mother had been sent the same message from him.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Yes, I treat the Facebook memories function as an opportunity to check myself. I'm like,
Yeah.
should we mute this one or not? But
I know.
I never want to forget these
And look, I
moments.
think the difference, though, is that my daughter knows that I love her, and
Yeah.
it wasn't a riff thing, and we had a bit of a joke about it while I was there and so on.
Yeah.
And I think that your children would be fine too later on, because they know how much you and Patrick love them, and how in difficult circumstances they've been raised in love.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters. But so what I noticed on this post I just was going to mention was something about, it was a post about your daughter and something about nuts.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, that was so funny. So what happened was Henry and Allegra had a fight. And I mean, they do. And I just didn't want to tell either of them off because they were just siblings squabbling. So we're out the front, and I live in quite a densely populated street. I know a lot of my neighbours. I know all of them, actually. And I said to her, look, sometimes brothers just drive sisters nuts. And she was so upset. She goes, girls don't have nuts. and just absolutely and I had to not laugh in that moment. But then she's having a meltdown over how she thinks that I think she's got nuts. And I'm like, so having this whole conversation about, and we don't say nuts, we say testicles. And I was going, I know you don't have testicles, and it's no, nuts means crazy too. And then I'm like, am I using ableist language here? And we're having it was hilarious. But the other thing is about her that she's so at peace with body parts and using the right kind of language and everything. But she's also, and this I'm really proud of myself about, because I'm still learning about consent.
Yes.
But my girl's got a lock on it. Like she doesn't like kisses without consent, and she doesn't like pictures taken without consent.
Good.
And I love that. And there's been, because people just used to take from kids, you will give auntie a hug, you will give uncle a hug, we'll sit on uncle's knee. And the bodily autonomy, like the walls just came down. And then how were we as children supposed to find the language to say, this makes me uncomfortable, I'm okay with it? So it was really important for Patrick and I that we taught them that. It does bite you in the ass a little bit sometimes. She's not easy to get to sleep at this point. And it could have been a frustrating day, and it'd take me ages to get her to sleep. Finally, they went to sleep, and then I went and did some housework and came back up and just was so overcome with how cute they look when they're sleeping. I bent down to give her a kiss on the head, and her eyes have shot open in the darkness of night, and she goes, I did not consent. And I was like, what? I had to, again, not laugh because it is hilarious.
Yeah.
But other people would take offense to that. Like, you're my child. You will let me do to you what I want you to, I want to do to you. But no, she is her own little person. And if at age 5, at 4, she could wield that sort of terrifying defense of her own body, even in a half awake state, I was like, okay, high five. You don't need me anymore. We're done. Because as a woman who was about to turn 40, about to enter the golden age of her life, and dating, I never would have thought that I'd have to deconstruct purity culture, but I'm having to learn the language of consent. I'm having to learn the language of boundaries. And dating is really a juggernaut in your 40s anyway. But when you're finally starting to understand the complex and embedded and deep levels of dysfunction that were handed down to us by purity culture, which did start, like policing women's bodies started a long time ago. Yeah, long before Josh Harris wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, long before in the 50s there were these secret pregnancies and these houses for unwed mothers and
children taken away from their young mothers, and
long before that stuff. Long before that.
Claire, let me ask you can you, for a listener who, and we probably have 3 now, which is great.
Hi guys.
If for a listener who doesn't really understand purity culture, can you explain to them succinctly, but within your own experience, how was it within your church?
Yeah, sure.
Your parents' church.
It's interesting how deeply entrenched purity culture and patriarchy are. It's interesting looking back in the Bible now how much policing women's bodies back then was about ensuring that your inheritance was left to actually your child, because they didn't have paternity tests in Jacob's day, did they?
No, they didn't. Didn't
But
have a lot of things in Jacob's day.
but we come to now, and the world, the women are now recognized for what the beautiful things they can be, and the beautiful things we are, the strong, resilient, uniquely able to multitask things that we are. My experience of purity culture was pretty typical of a lot of evangelicals in the beginning. We listened to Rebecca St. James, I am waiting for you, darling. We listened to DC Talk, I don't want it. I don't want your sex for now. We all wanted the sex, but we learned to subjugate that. Then Josh Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, came out.
So say that one again. What was the name of that book?
I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Yes. And the irony is Josh Harris is now deconstructed, removed the book from circulation. Sadly, his marriage didn't survive. And his ex-wife, Shannon Bond, she's just about to release her memoir. And he's actually had to really face off against the damage that his book did. But really, it built on generations of patriarchy and of policing women's bodies and of complementarianism and unhelpful doctrine. But we wore purity rings. So I've still got my purity ring upstairs because it's gold and it's got a diamond in it, and I might want to pawn that off one day. But it is weird.
How do you spell that pawn? How do you?
PAWN.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. But that's a whole nother conversation. There is ethical porn, guys, and not all porn uses addiction. Okay, let's just put that there.
That's true.
We had, so the I Kissed Dating Goodbye thing happened, and then we were all taken with this idea that dating was practice for divorce, and that basically if you were dating, you were setting yourself up for heartbreak. And then there was another church, a sister church from the Isaac Network that came through, and they had this high intensity discipleship program, and they delivered the courtship drama. And it was the Forrest Gump suite, and it was a dancer all in virginal white. And it basically portrayed a story of how every time she had an emotional or physical interaction with a man, it would take part of her heart. And it was beautifully done. It was artistic. It was gorgeous. Yes. And this was part of a broad movement. It was purity rings. There was this chat that why buy the cow when they give away the milk for free? So we're cows. Every time you have sex or every time you have an intimate connection with a man before marriage, which in our case, my case was interpreted down to flirting. I remember getting in big trouble for flirting once when I was 18, another time when I was 16, big shame around flirting. And look, I'll say it up front, I'm a bubbly person.
Of course
I flirt.
Of course you are.
And flirting is a gift. And flirting isn't always a bad thing. It can be fun, and it can be non-sexual. It can be it can be a key aspect of hospitality or retail sales.
Of course it can.
Flirting with people. I was in big trouble a few times for that.
Think of some of the, I'm agnostic these days, but I can think of some of the lady and men, TV evangelists and so on that I don't follow. What do they do?
Yeah.
There's so much sex in what they're doing.
Oh, gosh. The sexual repression in churches leaks out. It finds its way. Some songs really crack me up because they're so sexual in their language and people are worshipping with their O faces on. And just as a keyboard player, I'd just be looking at this sea of people going, I should not be thinking this, man. But anyway.
I love it.
Anyway, so we really cottoned on to this purity culture thing. A lot of us had purity rings. We all pledged to save ourselves for marriage. And then what would happen is there was accountability structures around. We were all discipling each other, and you could find yourself bumped up the discipling tree or bumped down the discipling tree based on how people thought you were going. Courtship was introduced as the way. So what we would do is courting is basically dating with the intention to marry, but there was all these accountabilities into it. So we would, first of all, if we were interested in someone, we'd have to submit that to the pastor. Dad. In other churches, it was really complex. If you're interested, say Harry and Sally have got crushes on each other, Harry would have to tell his dad, he would have to tell her dad. They'd pray about it and then present it to Sally. In other churches, you've prayed about it, you've approached the pastor, you've said, I think this person's the one for me. Then it would be, don't talk to each other for 6 months, avoid each other, look, really see whether it's God or whether it's just chemistry. And that was bonkers. In my case, I'd turned down a few matches over the years. And then by the time Dad suggested me to Patrick, And you can find out how that went down on 60 Minutes. I won't go into it again. By the time I'd agreed to the courtship, we had to put all these rules in place. We wouldn't be alone together. We wouldn't hold hands before this stage. I think it was about 6 weeks in, we held hands. We didn't kiss until 2 days before our wedding. There was a lot of rules and regulations. Of course, I was 27 and he was 23 when we first started courting, which was a disaster. I had PTSD and some very, very unique ways of hiding my meltdowns. And he wanted to be part of that space. I wanted to hide it from him. He ended up going through gay conversion therapy in the year that we were broken up. The first iteration of our relationship was a disaster. I think I've cried in every restaurant in Gippsland, but it turned out being a really beautiful marriage. And he was a really beautiful husband and he's still a really beautiful friend. But anyway, our church was probably on the more hardcore end of the courtship doctrine because most people didn't actually approach their dads about it. They approached dad about it, and that's where it creeps into this really interesting space. They've said they don't arrange marriages. That's fine for them to say that. When you look on Wiki, you check out the different types of arranged marriages, we've got a spectrum. So on the one hand is free marriage. Harry meets Sally. Harry and Sally decide they like each other. Harry and Sally get married.
Yeah.
That's a free marriage. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the arranged marriage where Harry doesn't see Sally. Sally doesn't see Harry.
No.
They turn up on the wedding day. They marry each other. So that's one iteration of it. Then you come a little further along the spectrum where Harry and Sally get to decide whether or not they're going to accept the match. And then we've got this other space in the middle, which is, I think it's called a limited endogamous kind of marriage. It's not common where within a group or a culture, and I would argue that these churches that practice this, they're microcosms of their own sort of culture.
Yeah.
They actually, where the parties in the marriage seek permission or blessing from a third party who is not necessarily a parent, who might be a spiritual leader or whatnot. That's what these ones were, in my view. We sought dad's permission. Okay. Or in my case, dad actually made the first approach. So I call it an arranged marriage. But that said, I did choose it. I did say yes. I wasn't aware. I was brainwashed into thinking that there wasn't any such thing as homosexuality, that it was a demon that needed to be cast out, or it was a mental illness. I now know that was just the dumbest thing. And I really hate that I once thought that, but you can't hate yourself for what you were indoctrinated or brainwashed into. I fully believed he was cured, but he was the only one who told me about that. Nobody else in my advisory circle who knew about the fact that he had identified as gay, who knew about the gay conversion therapy. Nobody else took me aside and went, you're rolling the dice with this guy. Maybe you want to kiss him before your wedding day, see whether there's anything happening. Nothing like that. It was just, this is God's man for you, full steam ahead kind of thing. And cringingly, this is mortifying and also hilarious. I worked as a bra fitter for 5 years. And I was also really the only reader in the homeschool group. So when I got the puberty chat, it was essentially the purity chat and Dr. James Dobson's Preparing for Adolescence.
Oh, the wonderful Dr. James Dobson.
Yeah, focus on the family. Ooh la. That is a whole kettle of fish. Yeah. And then on the week of my wedding, Mum decides to take me out to a favourite restaurant and have the chat that mothers have been having with their daughters for generations. So there we are at the Bunnings Cafe.
And just say again how old you are.
29.
Oh.
But the Bunnings Cafe, for any listeners overseas, it's a hardware store. It's like a hardware mega store in a tin shed. It's echoey. Yeah. It's not the best cafe. So you've got Sharon on the coffee machine just burning the shit out of the milk, and the milk is screaming for the sweet release of death, like me. And there's this table of dear old ladies with their purple rinses and their ill-fitting dentures sitting at the table over. And my siblings and I used to pick on Mum we used to joke that maybe she was a bit hard of hearing, but I honestly think maybe she was. So she is yelling the sex talk at me.
Oh God.
In the Bunnings Cafe.
Oh shit, I should say.
And I just remember just being so mortified. And she had this gift bag, and bless her, she was just doing the best she could in a system that had really, that I believe, removed so many opportunities from my mother. She homeschooled 5 kids and she was a stay-home pastor's wife, never had a full-time job, all that kind of stuff. She was doing the best she could. Dad had played the role in setting us up, in supervising our courtship, and she hadn't played any role at all, apart from silence, essentially. She's got this gift bag, and I was thinking that gift bag must be the answer to my problems. I need to get out of this horrendously awkward conversation. So I've reached across the table and I've taken the gift bag. And it is at that moment that Sharon stops. I mean, her name wasn't Sharon. It's at that moment that the barista stops burning the shit out of the milk. The sound level in the cafe dips. I pull out a whole lot of black hand towels and I look at them thinking, what the heck? And my mother yells, oh, they're because somebody has to sleep in the wet spot. And I just, oh God, it was the most withering conversation. I was just thankful in that moment that it was in the Bunnings Cafe, because I never had to walk back into it ever again.
Oh dear.
So that was purity culture. But in around that, there was a lot more, the messages about sexuality, about all that kind of stuff was really sex negative. And at one point, the men in the church were given a browser called Covenant Eyes. I don't know whether you've heard of this, but Covenant Eyes essentially sends a log of everything you've Googled to a covenant partner or an accountability partner, because there was some statistics about the percentage of men who use porn. And anyway, so our church was using Covenant Eyes. The women didn't have to, because the idea is that women aren't.
Oh, they're pure.
Yeah.
They're naturally pure anyway. You're not interested in that stuff.
Yeah, we're not interested in sex, which is, of course, if you then are a woman who has any sort of libido, you put shame on that.
Word that you can be called for that. I don't want to use it here.
Yeah, the J-bomb or the...
No, it starts with S, it ends in T, and it's not shit.
If you're too sexual, you'd get called a Jezebel, or you'd get called dysfunctional or demon-possessed or all that kind of stuff. Although demon-possessed wasn't really a word that city builders used. There was a lot more complicated language around that. But if you need an exorcism, then the inference is there. Or if you need deliverance, the inference is there. You don't need to use the possession kind of term. But yeah, so the men were using Covenant Eyes. Patrick refused because he said, I'll just download another browser. But to me, this goes to Robert Lifton's milieu control. Robert Lifton being an author who studied the totalism, mind control.
He's got a definition of cults that's been used for years. Yeah,
it is a very good authority on this. And milieu control is one of those. It's control of the information, control of communication. And we had these accountability structures. We also had software, like Covenant Eyes. We also had these books that we would read and internalize. And your devotion during the week would be guided by what was preached on a Sunday. And there were, of course, other people who did their own devotion additionally, but a lot of us didn't. A lot of us just ate what we were fed. So Covenant Eyes to me was a real, it was a double-edged sword. Because it was confusing in that it put expectations on women to not be sexual. It shamed porn use, but it also demonized men for being sexual creatures. And here's my take on it. Porn is problematic in a whole lot of ways, but not the ways we think it is. There is some debate in psychological circles whether sex addiction or porn addiction is a legitimate thing. Some people think it is, some people think it's not. The predominant place that you'll hear conversations about porn addiction, I will hear it every now and then in secular circles, but more by and large, it's men in Christian circles who say, I'm addicted to porn. And what I think that is shame attached to the use of anything increases our complexity with that thing. So if I have shame around the use of chocolate, I'm going to not eat chocolate, not eat chocolate, not eat chocolate.
Yes.
And then I'm going to binge on that. And then I'm going to feel guilty about the binge. And then I'm going to interpret my inability to not eat chocolate as a chocolate addiction.
Yes.
You got to ask the question, is it harmful? If it's all I'm eating, if I've got scurvy because there's no vitamin C in my diet because chocolate is all I'm eating, then yes, it's a problem. And what we're seeing is in the incel movement or in purity culture, even reliance on porn does cause problems in a sexual relationship because it's not real. And there's this expectation of all this stuff that is men deserve or that sex is, that it's just not. That's when porn becomes problematic. porn can be problematic because of the rights and the boundaries of the actors and actresses behind the scenes. But now there's this movement of ethical porn, where people are directing their own, where people are choosing who they do scenes with, choosing who they produce with. And it's a great thing about OnlyFans, to be quite honest, because producers are now in control of their own sets, their own partners, their own money, and there's not the same degree of exploitation in these ethical porn settings. So there's that. We don't need to feel guilt about that if we're consuming the right type of porn. It's okay also to not want to use it at all. It's not my thing. Every now and then I look at it and go, maybe it's my thing. And then I go, no, it's really not my thing. I do not enjoy this. But for other people, the guilt associated with porn use can create this idea in their head that they're porn addicted when actually all they are is ashamed about it. And if we can change the conversation around shame, we can stop this binge purge cycle around it and bring it all into a healthier space where you ask yourself, is it helpful for me? Is it helpful for my relationship? Is it just like having a glass of wine every other weekend, or is it like drinking a bottle of whiskey every night? Then you ask yourself the question. But making members of your church put covenant eyes on their phone so that they can be basically audited and shamed for their consumption of anything from swimsuit advertising to the more hardcore stuff, I think that's problematic. I think that's gross.
It is too. And I keep asking the question, why has religion, the Christian religion and others, been so interested in our bedrooms, in the privacy of our bedrooms? If it was a neighbour who was coming and looking in the window, you'd say that was a perversion. This is not a neighbour. This is the church. And it's the church is dictating, or it's the synagogue, or it's the temple, or whatever. I have two examples there just to mention to you, which I think you might find interesting, and I'd love your comments on them. One of them is an interview I did with a man called Onyx Bukenya.
Oh, that's a cool name.
He's a cool name, yes. And I think he's a wonderful man. He headed up a safe house in Nairobi for queer folk. And he started it, and it's been going for 5 or 6 years. And he's now in Seattle. And so you can see the interview on my podcast. Now I asked him specifically because I never knew his own story. I think he's as honest as the day is long, but he told me his personal story, and he says he's bisexual. He was caught at school with at the time, another boy. Both of them were thrown into different rooms, locked in the rooms overnight. Their parents were called. His father comes along and says, I wish I'd brought my machete. Now, he meant it. And in the podcast, we understand why the fathers have such a strong attitude and will kill their child.
Oh, my goodness. That makes my stomach drop.
Yeah. And it's because in their culture, and my argument is that it's an imposed culture, which has come from missionaries, from different religions, but of course the Christian religion, who have taught that these gay people were accepted for centuries in most tribes. The trans people were celebrated as having wonderful gifting and sometimes close to angels or whatever. But teachings that are so wrong have brought this about. Now, he has to escape his father, right? And he does that. And he goes to another village, because he actually sees his father coming home to the house when he finally gets taken home to the house, carrying a new machete.
Oh, my gosh.
So he escapes, and in this other house, he's in this other village and trying to survive, and he ends up with a boyfriend. And the boyfriend's father, I think, was in the police or something like that. And one day, it's either the father or someone else turns up with an AK-47 or whatever they are.
An assault rifle. Great.
And goes into the bedroom while Onyx is out buying drinks and shoots dead the boy on the bed. The boy's just sitting on the bed and he just shoots him dead. Now, of course, the police don't investigate these things. So that's the extreme of society cult invading our bedrooms. The other thing I was just going to mention, which I think you might find interesting, is I work in disability these days. And one of the things that you have to be challenged with is that it's like often having people with intellectual disabilities are like having big kids like your kids, okay? But they're big kids.
Yeah.
And so we have all kinds of conversations and things. But I'm often troubled when I think about people who may be paraplegic or quadriplegic,
Yeah.
and they still have their sexual desires.
Yeah.
These evil, sinful sexual desires. So some of them may watch porn or whatever. Some of them, male or female, may be able to relieve their sexual tensions.
Yeah.
Sometimes assistance is provided for them.
Yeah.
But the message from the church, from the purity culture, would be that this is purely sinful.
Yeah.
And these people have to overcome, amongst all the other shit they're trying to cope with in their lives.
Yes.
They've got to repress this.
Yeah.
That's why I say that if it's not talked about, if it's not discussed, it's disgusting.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good line. Oh, that's true. Wow.
I think it's a good one too. You can use it. If it's not discussed, it's disgusting.
Yeah.
And that disgust stays with us. As I said to you earlier, you're about to turn 40 next year. I turn 70.
Yeah.
And I'm even realizing, since I've started this podcast, how much sex shame has affected me.
Yes.
And as I said to you also, the question I ask of people is, how did you get your sex talk? You got a great sex talk at 29 in Bunnings.
In the Bunnings Cafe, 29. Oh, the funny thing is, okay, so there's a few things. The time I actually got the sex talk, it was from a friend who worked with me at Maya, and it was hilarious because they drew illustrations on the scrap paper that used to be beside the point of sale, and one of those girls, who was absolute just light and joy to me during such a traumatic time of my life, she's now a member of Parliament.
Really?
She's now a Labor MP. And when we were going through all of the investigative journalism thing.
Victoria or
Victoria, she's Dr. Karina Garland, Seat of Chisholm. She gave me the sex talk along with another one of the bra fitters from Maya Southland. And she's a wonderful person. She's so wonderful. I'm so proud of her. But she was mortified that I told her that during the whole discovery process with Nick Mackenzie, because he had to understand purity culture and all that kind of stuff and conversion practices and the breadth of that definition. So I actually told him the Bunnings Cafe story and then said, oh no, but the person who actually gave me the sex talk was Dr. Karina Garland, member for Chisholm. And he cracked up laughing. He thought that was bloody funny.
I love it.
But look, as to why church is so interested in our bedrooms, I joke that it is biblical illiteracy that they read Gentile Christian, meaning non-Jew, and read it as genital Christian, and that has informed the rest of our kind of conversation around it.
I got that too quickly.
In actual fact, experiences like Onyx's is spiritual colonialism. And now we're at a junction point in history where we're starting to face up to the damage of colonialism. And we need to face up to the damage of spiritually colonizing people, spiritually cutting themselves off from source, from origin, from their stories, from their traditions that have helped them interact with the world for so long, all based on this incredibly egocentric idea that ours is the right way. And when our way has done so much harm, has started so many wars, has been the seed point for genocide, we've got no.
Absolutely.
But the other thing I think is that so much of it comes from fear. Right back from the beginning, it was, we didn't have DNA tests. The woman was this sacred carrier of life, and the man was only there for the beginning of it. How could he make sure that child was his, that the inheritance he was leaving was his? And there's this whole piece about patriarchy and about how it started. Like originally, things were different. Women were honoured as being sacred, as being bull. But over time, we've moved men out of the homes and they've been able to congregate in these places and have these conversations and make these laws that women haven't been part of. And this has gone into how the Bible was interpreted, canonized, translated, all of that kind of stuff. It's interesting you raise trans people. There is some progressive theology. And I have issues with progressive theology. I think it's better than conservative theology, but maybe we need to just throw the whole thing out because it's so problematic and so far away from original translation anyway, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole conversation. But there's this train of...
There is no original manuscripts.
No, it's just pieces of
You go back far enough and there are no original manuscripts.
So what the heck are we basing all of this fear and Yeah. It's fear and transphobia and
No,
stuff
it
based
is.
on Chinese whispers, essentially.
right.
But there's this idea that maybe Joseph was trans, which we
Yeah.
were told it was sibling rivalry that had his 10 brothers sell him into slavery as an improvement on the idea of killing him.
Yeah.
We've had this idea that the coat of many colors, there's no other word that's comparable to it in the Bible, apart from Esther's princess dress, I've heard.
right.
I don't know how true that is, but
I've read the same thing.
yeah, what if Joseph was trans? What if that's the reason he turned down Potiphar's wife? What
right.
if that's the reason he fit in so well in Egypt, which was this beautiful, ornate, expressive culture at the time? But even Joseph's, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph's dad, there's all this conversation about the twins,
Yes.
Jacob and Esau, how Jacob came out holding Esau's heel. So
Yep.
were they twins, like mono and mono twins? Were they identical? We don't know. We know Esau was hairy. We know that Jacob was smooth. We know that Esau was out in the field. We know that Jacob was back cooking with the women. So
can't be mono. Sure.
So, or one is changing his appearance.
Could be too.
Because he doesn't fit with the gender binary the way that his other brother did.
Yeah.
What was he doing back cooking with the women when his role was out in the field?
I know.
So
I find that fascinating, that one.
Yeah. So the queer history of the Bible is right there. But the power structures in society have protected this, they've fostered and protected this patriarchy. And we're at a time in history now where there's this kind of pushback against this feminism. We've got these Andrew Tates of the world who are trying to bring back the alpha male. And we've got women going, I don't need the alpha male, which is a terrifying moment for men because they've got to either evolve or just not get laid. And the possibility is that they just won't get laid or they won't have the wives and the families that they feel they deserve. But all along, church has been adapting itself to this culture, has been supporting this culture of patriarchy, has been reading the Bible in such a way that it justifies their misogyny. And yes, I'm using heavy words here, but I 100% believe it.
Oh, I think there's a direct correlation between sex shame and misogyny, and then the more recent hatred of LGBTIQ people.
Yeah.
And it's all about that. So it's, again, coming back to that saying, if it's not discussed, it's disgusting.
Yeah.
And the more disgusting we can make it, the more we can separate ourselves from it, the better we look in our own eyes.
Yeah.
And the more we're justified in our hate.
Yeah. And it's just inexcusable. It's inexcusable. I used to try to jump through some hoops to try to justify it. But then being married to a man who was coming to terms with his sexuality, I started to realize that his honesty, the depth with which he was going through this process of trying to figure out whether God hated him so much he would predestine him for hell before birth.
Yeah.
And nothing he could do, because a lot of people think, being gay is a choice, which is rubbish. They also mistakenly think that it's what you do that makes you gay. It's not. It's who you are. It's everything from the pitch of your voice to the expression with which you dress yourself in the morning or do your hair. Like when you're repressing yourself, you're repressing all of that. Patrick would consciously not dress as he wanted to and consciously talk in a different way.
Yeah.
To cover his tracks.
Yeah.
Imagine living with that degree of hypervigilance applied to every area of your life. How could I hate him for that? How could I be anything but grateful for the way he invited me into this area of his life that he felt was all darkness? And sure, there were moments of real struggle because I had to be like, if I support this man in this, am I going to lose my marriage and my family?
Yes.
And I did lose my marriage, but I did not lose my family.
Yeah.
When we... on the 20th of January 2020, as we were getting into bed, I remember he stood on the left side of the bed and he pulled back the covers and he said to me, "We're doing really well." And I was like, "Yeah, I know." And he said, "I'm also calling helplines a lot." And I said, "Yeah, I know." And he said, "We need to transition this marriage to a friendship." And let's be honest, for 2-3 weeks, I felt intensely. I was angry. I was upset. I was also very careful about who I ranted to because I realized that if anyone was going to get me out of sale, it was this man. And if now that I did not have the option to fight for my marriage anymore, I had to fight for the family life I wanted.
Yeah.
And I wanted family days. I wanted family dinners. I wanted not to be amicable for the kids. I wanted to be able to have a glass of whiskey with my best friend on a Friday night and bitch about how hard parenting has been that day. And just this week, he called me to ask me some questions about a really personal thing for him, and is coming around probably in about 20 minutes to help me get the house ready for a rental inspection. And 3 years post separation, we are best friends, and it's such an honor to be, because I can still see him in his fullness for all the wonderful things he is, even as he wades through, as both of us wade through some pretty traumatic stuff in deconstructing all that's gone before us and really facing up to the trauma of what happened. And that's an honor. It's not disgusting. He's a beautiful human, and I'm so proud of him. And James, gosh, James, because James was assigned female at birth, ironically misgendered more when he was living pre-transition.
Okay.
We used to always laugh when James was mistaken as being a prophet did it. Oh, you're such a mighty man of God. I said to James the day after he recorded 60 Minutes, I was like, maybe that prophet was right. I remember the day that James recorded his interview, the producer and the journalists are like, oh, we just want to make sure that we get James's pronouns right.
Yeah.
And I was like, you're not going to misgender James. And they're like, no, we really just want to hear him. I was like, no, trust me, you're not going to misgender James. James turns out balding. I'm like, oh, we're not going to, because it's my absolute conviction that he is now who he always should have been.
Yeah.
Because looking back at photos of him before the transition doesn't make sense.
No.
And I'm so proud of Patrick, of James, of other people in the group of survivors who have faced conversion practices. And I always say conversion practices because it's not just conversion therapy, also the weaponization of exorcism. It's the weaponization of pastoral care, where they're counseled towards this person of the opposite sex they're going to marry, and it's the weaponization of prophecy, and it's misogynistic messages in discipleship sessions, and not misogynistic, it's like transphobic, homophobic messages in discipleship sessions from the pulpit, leadership meetings. It's all this kind of stuff. It's more than just the therapy.
The community picks that up.
And it becomes part of our internal schema.
Yeah. So in a sense, even though, you're shunned when you leave, there is a benefit for you in that. Not that I'm justifying it, because I think shunning is a horrible thing. And I often ask the question, where is love? If the highest thing that a person can do, in my view, is genuinely love another person.
Yeah.
And loving the person who's most difficult to love is the biggest challenge of all.
Yeah.
Claire, this has been wonderful talking to you today, and we could go on for quite a bit longer, couldn't we? I think.
We could.
Just to finish, can I ask you just to tell me a little bit about your podcast and your work now, and so that you can give yourself a little bit of promo?
A little bit of promo, yes, because self-promotion is something I'm so good at.
That's good.
So I have two very different lines of work. I'm a neuroscience writer, and I run editorial and author coaching for an indie publishing house. So Claire McIver is the name I use for all of those things.
Yep.
And so I did have to split out my identity a little bit, just for branding's sake. So Kit Kennedy is the name I chose for that, because it's the name of both of my grandmothers. Kit was my dad's mum, and Kennedy was my mum's maiden name. So Kit Kennedy you can find me on Twitter as Kit M for McIver Kennedy. Kit M Kennedy is also, I'm on Instagram, Unchurchable Pod, and unchurchablepodcast.com. I'm on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Unchurchable really it's for people for whom faith and spirituality is a hell yes, but church is a hell no. There's a whole spectrum. I've interviewed atheists, agnostics, pagans. I've interviewed sex educators and intimacy coaches. Really, it's about pulling apart the experiences that we've had as a collective and as individuals, wading our way through evangelicalism or ex-evangelicalism now. Last week, I interviewed Angela Harrington, she's fully been through seminary and all that kind of stuff, and now she's a deconstruction coach. Coming up, I've got the gents from I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, and I've also got Kate West, who's written a book on her experience as being a stay-home daughter in that kind of Vision Forum stay-home daughter movement. So there's all sorts of interesting content there. And we do get a bit geeky because I am proudly a geek. I love theology and I love to hate theology and I love to love it and all of those things. Churchable podcast, Churchable with Kit Kennedy on Spotify and iTunes. Fantastic. And yes, I do blog at Unchurchable Podcast as well. So me.
That's wonderful. And look, once again, I'm really grateful for our time today. And I will never think of a Bunnings Cafe again without thinking of you.
You're welcome. Next time you're there in the plant section and you hear that, you're like, there it is.
And I promise you, I'll be nice to Sharon.
Yes, be nice to Sharon. She's doing the best she can.
Thanks,
it was
Claire.
A pleasure, David.
Good on you. Please don't forget to support the podcast through Patreon, other sources, or direct to our website. This podcast supports refugees who are suffering terribly in Africa because of religious hate. It's time to show them some love.